Thanks so much for joining us today for Seeking Truth and Justice for the LGBTIQ community in Colombia. My name is Ashley Armstrong, and I'm a communications co-director at Interpares. And I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the original guardians of this land, and acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. For those of you who know us well, and for those of you who are new, Interpares, which means Among Equals, is a feminist social justice organization that believes in solidarity as an approach to international cooperation. Our programs largely focus on 6 global issues: food sovereignty, gender justice, peace and democracy, economic justice, health, and migration. And we work with long-term counterparts who are local and national social justice organizations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Canada. And if you're looking for more information about us, you can visit us on our website at interpares.ca or find us on social media. So before we jump into the conversation, a few logistics to note. If you need any tech support, please reach out at any point in the webinar to Monique. She'll have tech beside her name in the chat. And the chat will be open throughout the webinar, so feel free to pop your questions and comments in there, and we'll come back to them after the conversation. And like I mentioned earlier, we'd love to know who's joining us and from where, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And lastly, the webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sure to share that recording with you afterwards. So you've all joined us today to learn more about how Colombia Diversa is seeking truth, justice, and guarantees of non-recurrence for LGBTIQ victims and survivors of Colombia's armed conflict. I'm joined today by my colleague, Bill Fairbairn, and Maria Susana Peralta, Program Coordinator with Colombia Diversa. Welcome, Bill and Susana. Thanks for being here with us today. Before we pass the mic over to Bill and Susana, we'd love to get a sense of how you are connected to Colombia. So you'll see a poll pop up on your screen here. So feel free to fill it in when you have a moment. What is like, have you traveled to Colombia? Are you from Colombia? Do you have family in Colombia? Is your work centered around Colombia? Take a minute to fill it in there, and we'll have a look at the results. Okay, sure. Monique, do you mind pulling up the results there? Great, thank you. So the majority of people who are with us today, their work either centers around Colombia or they have friends and family in Colombia. So it looks like close connections to the country there, and perhaps some already existing understanding of the topic that we're going to discuss today. So that's great. On that note, I'll pass it over to Bill and Susana to get started.
Great, thanks, Ashley. For the introduction. As Ashley said, I'm Bill Fairbairn. I'm Latin American Program Manager at Interpares, and I'm so happy to be joined today by our dear friend and colleague, Susana Peralta from Bogota. Interpares has worked with counterparts in Colombia since the 1990s, and we're so proud to count Colombia Diversa as one of our counterparts. By way of background to today's webinar, although I'm sure given the profile of who's on the call today, many of you already know it, but Colombia, it's a country that's been profoundly marked by armed conflict and mass human rights violations. But at the same time, it's an amazing country with a vibrant civil society and some of the most courageous human rights activists and social leaders that I've ever met in my life. I've had the privilege of traveling to many parts of Colombia over the past 3 decades, and it's a country that's very close to my heart, as many of you know. Now, there have been many attempts over the years to bring an end to Colombia's armed conflict, or perhaps I should say conflicts, since there are a variety of conflicts and armed actors in Colombia. Colombian civil society has played a key role in pressing for a negotiated end to these conflicts, and especially in calling for the root causes of the conflicts to be addressed. Some of these efforts have been successful while others have failed. In 2016, the Colombian government signed an historic peace agreement with the largest guerrilla army, the FARC, bringing a formal end to over 50 years of armed conflict. This was a huge achievement and the result of years of negotiations that took place for the most part in Havana, Cuba. There's a lot to be said about this process, and we'll hear some today from Susana. But one thing that's remarkable is that it's the first peace agreement in the world to recognize LGBTI rights. And Colombia Diversa played a key role in making that happen. So now with this little bit of background, let me introduce our special guest, Susana Peralta, who will speak to us about this groundbreaking work. So welcome, Susana. Susana is a lawyer, a lesbian, and a feminist activist whose recent work has focused on LGBT inclusive peace building. She's the coordinator of Colombia Diversa's Peace and Transitional Justice area. And for the past 2 years, she's been focused on researching prejudice-based violence in the Colombian armed conflict, representing LGBT victims before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is the Colombian transitional court established under the terms of the peace agreement. And she's engaged in national and international advocacy to promote LGBT rights and inclusion in peace building, including before the International Criminal Court. I should say that this work has been supported in part by the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program, PSOPs of Global Affairs Canada, for which we're grateful. So Susana, we're so happy to have you with us today. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Bill, for such a warming and kind presentation. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to chat with you, and I'm happy to get an opportunity to tell everyone what we're doing in Colombia and what opportunities arise for LGBT people, especially those who are hardly victims, well, not hardly, strongly victims of the armed conflict we're trying to overcome.
Great. Well, on that note, maybe before we get into the armed conflict, can you tell us a bit more about Colombia Diversa? When and how was it formed?
Yes, for sure. Our story begins around 2004 when Marcela Sanchez, who is our current executive director, gathered like a small group of other interested Colombians in advancing LGBT human rights. With some economic, political, and also legal support, the organization came to life and started working with only 3 people: the accountant, a general assistant, and Marcela Sanchez herself. Soon enough, they realized a lot of work had to be done. So financial aid and more recruitment was definitely needed. So even though by then every legal and formal promise was truly forgotten, Colombia Diversa's first priority was not the legal advancement of LGBT equal rights, but to keep track of every LGBT homicide in order to apply strategical pressure on the Colombian government, hoping it would either start keeping their own records for such killings, and hopefully the Colombian government would design an institutional response to punish and prevent those killings. We have been doing that work of keeping track of those homicides for 17 years now. The Colombian government still hasn't done any of those things. They do not keep a record of LGBT homicides, and they do not prevent or try to repair those killings. But other things have improved since 2004. We have now equal rights. This is social rights, marriage, adoption. We have criminalized discrimination against LGBT people. We have mainstreamed gender and LGBT perspectives on every peace-building action. There is cheap and easy name and sex modification procedures for every legal document for trans people. There is also inclusion of those gender reaffirmation processes on our public healthcare system and so on. Colombia Diversa has been involved directly in every single one of those achievements. We've been lawyers, we've been participants, critics, advisors, plaintiffs. We have just tried to sneak in every little space we can find. So we're proud to keep doing it, and we are proud to keep finding new challenges and new opportunities to improve LGBT people's lives.
Yeah, those are huge achievements, you know, that you should be really proud of. And I can just imagine, I can imagine how you had to sneak into so many spaces, you know, which weren't open for you, you know. But it makes me think of what you were saying at the end, makes me think of the enormous contradiction that many of us often experience with Colombia. And I mean, Colombia, it's got one of the most amazing constitutions in the world. And it tends to sign and ratify every international human rights agreement, instrument that's out there. But there's a huge gap between the rhetoric, or what's, you know, the rights on paper, and the reality. So along those lines, I mean, you just named many of the gains that the Colombian queer community has made over the past years on paper. But what's the overall situation today for LGBTIQ people, both on, not just on paper, but also just in people's daily lives?
Thank you, Bill. Yes, definitely. For those of you who work or whose work centers around or revolves around Colombia, you definitely know the concept of the Colombian paradox. It is a thing, and it's strange to live within it. I already gave away some wins that we have got, but Colombia does have several challenges. Or does represent several challenges for how those promises and those legal reforms can actually transform LGBT people's lives. There are two interconnected phenomena that I want to mention particularly. The first is the overall discrimination and delegitimization of LGBT people, how everyone just stigmatizes and considers LGBT people like sick people, like monstrous people. And the second phenomenon is how this was a ripe fruit for war, how fruits were reaped by war, and particularly by those armed actors who participated directly in it. So first, our culture, Colombian culture, still rests on a general refusal of LGBT lives. We are not seen as worthy, we are not seen as important, and we are not seen as part of our communities. This means that people will estrange their children, kick them out of their houses, or abuse them trying to change them. Medical doctors will ask discriminatory questions and act based on harmful prejudice when treating LGBT patients. Even local authorities will make fun and harass trans people whose gender identity is not yet reflected on their identification papers. Or, for example, cops or police, men and women, won't believe LGBT people's claims of violence. And on the other hand, cultural representation is also scarce and biased. So you have every single element of our culture working against us, both in a more symbolic plane, but also on those material and immediate relationships we have with every other citizen. And second, the other phenomenon I was talking about, the armed conflict will go on in Colombia for as long as that meaningless war on drugs continues. And this is something I have to stress, and this is something I always insist on when speaking publicly. We won't fix this if we don't fix the drug problem, as we have named it in Colombia. Armies can change their sizes, they can change their political discourse, they can change their violent manifestations, but they will always exist as long as drug production and distribution is legal in Colombia. They will also always benefit from misogyny and homophobia. They will always carry weapons and harm civil society and instrumentalize LGBT people in order to display their cruel capacities, because there is always money in the mix for them. So as long as war is a business, which is most clearly seen when there are no solutions to illicit drugs use and regulation, LGBT people will be in harm's way. So right now, LGBT people who survive war with the FARC guerrilla and or with the paramilitary groups, they keep facing armed actors interested in exploiting their land and keeping a tight political and moral order in their territories, because there's still business to be made from the criminal's perspective. So to be a little bit brief, it depends. It depends where you live to answer how is it going for LGBT people in Colombia. If you are an LGBT person in one of those small cities or towns heavily affected by war, then you are most likely under some sort of warning or threat not to be too vocal or too transparent with your gender identity or with your sexual orientation. If you live like I do in a bigger city, then you are most likely reprimanded by your neighbors, by your high school teachers, your family members, but you can still find a safe space and build your own family with a respectable amount of safety and dignity. And this is probably what I would like to convey as a key message here. Liberal and legal promises need a parallel cultural intervention in order to materialize their capacities. Legislation and jurisprudence are important, and they were a battle for us. I know it, since from within Colombia Diversa, we have been working for it. But they mean nothing when bullies and armed actors get away with homophobia, with transphobia, with misogyny. And sometimes that is what happens in Colombia. You have a bunch of norms that protect you, that say what you can do and what others cannot do to you for being an LGBT person. But then nobody cares. The person who's in charge of giving you any service, medical service, hairdressing service, they'll make fun of you. So as long as daily lives are not different for LGBT people, it doesn't truly matter, or it doesn't matter as much that bigger promises are being made everywhere in the national and in the international platform.
Yeah, wow, so much in that response, Susana. Thanks so much. With respect to the 2016 peace agreement itself, as I mentioned, this was the first agreement in the world to recognize LGBT rights, and this is huge, you know. And clearly, it was a result of intense work by Colombian civil society, in particular Colombia Diversa and the queer community. Can you tell us? I'm just so interested in what that involved. Can you tell us, how do the two sides, the government and the guerrilla, react? What exactly are the provisions of the agreement that relate to LGBTQ people?
I love this question because it's like story time for me. I love telling this story over and over again. How we ended up with such a great document for finishing a harmful and bloody war. So peace, it was the year of 2012 when peace negotiations started. For 2 years, there were no women and no LGBT people involved in those negotiations. So in 2014, a national feminist movement decided to take matters in their own hands and hold local meetings all across the country. They gathered both women and LGBT people's opinions regarding the effects war had left on their lives and regarding what was required for truth-telling, for justice, for reparations, and how, most importantly, how to keep it from never happening again. After this feminist initiative took off, both the guerrilla and state representatives implemented some of the 500 recommendations that this feminist movement gathered up. This included women negotiators, and it, of course, included a gender approach all throughout the final peace agreement. Those two are, I think, the most important measures they took from this feminist national movement. So by 2016, there was, these two things were happening and they were going along. But by 2016, something really interesting happened. And it was that a small committee of feminists and LGBT activists, and I mean small, they were 12 or 10 people. They went to La Habana where negotiations were happening, and they did one final push in favor of women and LGBT people. I think this was the success for both social movements, for feminist and LGBT movement. This small committee, Marcela Sanchez was one of those 10 or 12 people. This small committee actually made sense out of those 500 recommendations they had seen. Most of the negotiators actually, both guerrilla and state representatives, came forward after the small committee had left the island. They came forward explaining feminism, explaining differential damages caused by war to women and LGBT people. So this recognition in paper transcended to a recognition in discourse. And therefore, the gender and LGBT approach pretty much came alive with a meaningful significance. It was not only a promise. It was not only like a pressure they had to give in. They were truly convinced. So to answer what this approach truly entails, I must do a quick summary. I'll be super brief. The final peace agreement has 5 chapters: land ownership, political participation, ceasefire, the drugs problem, and victims' access to truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. Every single one of those topics has specific measures to recognize and to remediate gendered effects of war against women and LGBT people. It is close to my heart what the Truth Commission and our Special Jurisdiction for Peace are doing. They're telling a more complete story of our conflict. They are making sure that those who knew and tolerated misogyny and LGBT phobia for war's sake are both culturally and judicially held accountable. So what happened in those negotiations is probably the opposite of what I just told you daily lives for LGBT people are. This was not only like an overall promise, this was something everyone was convinced of doing. So every institution that came out of this peace agreement understands and truly tries to implement this gender and LGBT approach in everything they do.
Oh, that's so amazing. I wish I'd been a fly on the wall of those meetings just to hear how it went. But now the agreement was reached, but now as part of the Colombian soap opera, there was a very tense moment at the end of the process, right, when the agreement almost collapsed. And it was because right-wing political forces and fundamentalist churches came together and they stoked homophobic and transphobic fear in order to convince the public to vote against the agreement, which was put to a referendum. And they were initially successful. So can you tell people, say a few words about that, what happened and how the agreement was finally saved in the end?
So this is the moment that the story I just told you becomes like a sad story. After we managed to include women and LGBT people's representation, after we managed to convince these white war men that were the states and guerrilla representatives in these negotiations, it ended up being that was our downfall. So I'll start from the beginning. That conservative coalition, it was a knockdown. It was an awful wake-up call for what we do, particularly in Colombia Diversa, because we had been there. We had been directly involved in that success. That is the part I just told you before. But now this coalition was using this gender approach against us. in the final peace agreement. So it reminded us to keep on our toes, to keep moving forward, to keep explaining why what we do matters and why discrimination is not a valid action or a valid discourse in our state. So to tell the story completely, by October 2016, when the agreement was finally written down, it was signed by both the guerrilla and the state representatives. Our then president, Juan Manuel Santos, who went on to receive a Nobel Peace Prize for this negotiation, Santos tried to gain overall support by submitting the peace accord to a referendum. It was a good idea. I understand his intentions. He was trying to give it some legitimacy it didn't have if it was only drafted and signed by these two parties. But we lost. Those in favor of the peace accord were 49.7% of the voters. Those against the peace accords were 50.2%. We lost by a difference of 0.5%, but it was a loss nonetheless. And the legitimization he was trying to gain, well, it backfired definitely. And now the public discourse and the cultural conversations, well, they had reason to be against the final peace accord because they lost the election. So what happened next after we lost? And that was difficult. That was one of my first times I could vote. I was just like 18 or something, so that was my first vote. It was devastating. We thought it was the end. We thought it was another unsuccessful peace process. But what happened next was a very creative move, I think worthy of an NGO. So what they did was they edited the peace accord, trying to understand and incorporate comments and critiques made from the opposition. So this meant leaving out some specific LGBT measures, but not all of them. What we did afterwards, and here I'm doing a 5-year jump, what we did afterwards was that the gender approach meant women and LGBT approach. But what they did was they sort of deleted those LGBT specific measures and they just said gender measures. So that edited peace accord was discussed and approved by the ordinary channels. So it went through Congress. And thankfully, thanks to this creative solution, the final peace agreement was finally included and validated as a norm in Colombia. So then we got to work on it. So this conservative coalition, and I think this is the part that interests me the most as well, for this international forum that we're talking today at, this conservative coalition inaugurated a gender ideology discourse against the peace process. So according to them, those who were in favor of making peace with the guerrilla actually wanted to include women and LGBT people only because we were trying to homosexualize every Colombian citizen. Of course, it doesn't make any sense for me, but for 50.2% of that referendum voters, it was profoundly true. So it also set the tone, and it was also like a cheat sheet for us because we got to see the we got to foresee the obstacles and challenges we would have to prepare to face during the peace process implementation. So by then we knew what kind of discourse, what kind of opposition we were going to face, and it gave us an opportunity to get ready and do some sort of strategy around it. That's how it went down. That's how we got up from it. That's how we recovered. And I promise it's not a sad story. It gets like a little bit of turmoil, but it ends up being a good story again.
Yeah, I know it's an incredible story, and we felt it here from Canada too. All of us were holding our breath you know, when we saw the result, and it was so important that it did, despite the opposition, it did go forward. So we're all so grateful for that. Now, since then, Colombia Diversa has been working to record the stories and make visible the impact of the armed conflict on LGBTQ people in Colombia, because it's, as you say, it's something that's often not even recorded. It's invisible, even for some of the traditional human rights groups. For a long time, it wasn't on their radar. So can you tell us more about what have you found? What are the findings, and how was the queer community in Colombia impacted specifically by the armed conflict?
Of course, I had prepared like 3 answers for this question, but now that we're talking, something new came to my mind. Something that I usually forget because I am too close to this. So I forget those huge wins that were like a precondition for my work. But this was a win. The fact that there was an agreement that called for the specific gaze of LGBT people. And then when that happened, and when everyone started working, implementing this peace accord, what they were saying, even though they meant well, but what every state officer or employee was saying was, but what does that have to do? Like, why is that relevant? Like, if you have, I don't know, a town that was affected by war, why is it different if you were a straight white man, or if you were, I don't know, a trans Black woman? Like, why is that relevant? And they were asking these questions from an honest and from a sincere and well-intentioned place in their hearts. So the first thing we discovered for them, not for us, of course, but for them, and they're the ones who matter because they're the ones who are implementing this accord. The first thing we discovered was that it was not random. It was not something left to, I don't know, luck or a gambling bet on who to attack. Armed actors had a strategic plan. They knew prejudice against LGBT people and women existed in communities. They knew how to use that in their own advantage. So the fact that there are LGBT people and women that were victims of this violence means that there is there's a whole story that has not been included in our national history. We have forgotten something that armed actors did not forget, that is the existence of prejudice and the existence of LGBT people in communities heavily affected by war. So definitely the first discovery was, it is not random. It is not something that just happened. It is not that he is a victim and he's also gay. It is better that he is a victim because he is gay. And that changes how you see, how you study, and how you repair war. So that was definitely the first one that I usually forget because, of course, it was tattooed in my mind since the beginning. The second discovery was, well, I just gave it out a little bit, that discrimination was at the core of the armed conflict. And I'm not talking only about LGBT people, I'm talking about discrimination in general. Conflict resolution by violent means is the gasoline that lighted up this war. And then when it was a huge fire, discrimination against LGBT people came in very handy for armed actors. They knew how to use it in their advantage. They benefited from the normalized homophobia and transphobia in the Colombian culture. They punished, and they expelled LGBT people when it helped their warfare enterprises. So this is not, how to say that? This is not a side effect of war, but this is a main objective of war, to use them and to take advantage of LGBT people in order to advance in whatever they needed. Using, for example, well, one of the way how I always explain this is, you want people, if you're an armed actor, you want people to fear you. You want people to obey what you say because you're capable of horrible things. So, but you don't want to antagonize the community because you need their support in the end. You want them to fear you, but you don't want them to turn against you. So what they did was they found people who they could use as a demonstration of their horrific capacities and violence that they knew they could get away with after hurting them. So what they did was they inflicted a lot of violence, and I really don't want to get into details, but they just did whatever they wanted to LGBT people in communities. And that gained them two things. First, people were now afraid of them. They definitely know how to use every kind of arm, like machetes, guns, ropes, whatever. And also, they are sort of on our same side, because us as the civil society community that was witnessing these attacks, we were also against that person. We also didn't like him. He was too showy, and he was too sensual, and he was gonna pervert my children. So maybe I do have something in common with this armed actor. The second discovery, well, the third discovery was that strict social norms about gender roles were behind many of those social conflicts we were not able to resolve peacefully. So part of what Colombians couldn't resolve was what being a man means, or what being a woman means, and what kind of conducts are allowed or forbidden for each gender. Heterosexuality, of course, was one of those main rules. It didn't have a way out. If you dared challenge it, then you had to face serious consequences coming from your family, from local authorities, and even from armed actors in your community. So it is not that we were bad at negotiating whatever we didn't agree on. It was also that we didn't agree on gender and sexuality. So when you have someone who's in charge of this territory and they're, I don't know, carrying guns, and they're in charge of trying to give solutions or dissolve conflicts amongst citizens, and you have a conflict about what gender or sexuality means, that means LGBT people are gonna get the worst part of it all. They're gonna have discussions about their bodies, about their feelings, from a guy holding, I don't know, how did you even call that? A huge gun, a metralleta. That is not who you wanna negotiate with, who you have sex with. That is definitely not how it should work. So we have found out that that was also part of war. And finally, and this is my favorite discovery of it all, we have found out that the LGBT movement in Colombia is a peace movement. Grassroots organizations gathered and provided shelter, food. They fulfilled basic needs when LGBT people were being persecuted and discriminated. When the 2016 referendum was announced, they did public appearances and political calls in order to approve it. Now you can see how that would backfire when the conservative wing was saying that we wanted to homosexualize everybody, and we had LGBT activists telling them to vote in favor of the peace accord, but they did it. They were trying to survive. They were trying to make ends meet, and they decided to go on a political campaign for a referendum that was negotiated, for a peace accord that was negotiated miles away from their homes. And after we lost, those LGBT activists and those grassroots organizations pushed it through Congress. They pushed whatever needed to be moved around in order that our peace accord would become alive. The LGBT movement has been working non-stop in making sure that a sustainable peace is achieved and that truth is told and that reparations are given away to LGBT victims. This is what has given me the most satisfaction from my work, seeing LGBT leaders truly committed with a peaceful society, even though when they could just turn their backs on every institutional initiative like this one. They could try to build their own social structures. They could try to build their own guerrilla. Even though state forces have been their perpetrators too, even though they still face violent threats, even though they gain no salary or no material benefit from this activism, they wake up every day. And every day they choose peace building. Every day they choose believing those promises enshrined in our peace accord. So, well, I can only follow their lead.
Oh, so inspiring. And I think that's what has moved me so much in Colombia too, that we're not talking just about LGBTQ people who are victims, who are survivors, but who are building peace, who are part of the social movement. And I think that there's, because of the work that you've done, there's growing awareness too within broad social movements that this is part of the Colombian family, right? This is another part. And so I see Ashley's put a note in to see if people have questions that they can send. Maybe while we're seeing if people have additional questions, maybe can you just say a few final words about what do you hope will come out of this process, this transitional justice process?
Sorry, always happens to me. I start talking with my mic muted. Well, what I hope, or what I am eager to see, is what policies wind up as a result of all of this. Because transitional systems, they are meant to exist only in order to disappear shortly. So we need to find something that works in the long run. This is not only for our transition. We need something that transforms and truly changes the country we live in. So I dream with, for example, meaningful sexual education, and that will help prevent misogynistic and homophobic attacks from everyone, from civil society, but also from armed actors. Armed actors, all of them, they had gone at least to 3 or 5 years of school, of public education. So if we have meaningful sexual education, then even though if we have armed actors, they won't be as insistent and persistent in homophobia or transphobia or misogyny. I also expect a report from our Truth Commission that will do right by LGBT victims, that share their stories and advocated for their own existence in the narrative of war and in the narrative of our country. I hope that this kind of institutional products will fuel other conversations or other cultural interventions that will lead to a meaningful transformation of the Colombian society. And I think, and this is me dreaming big, I hope someday we finally notice as a society how harmful this discrimination can be and how rich and interesting negotiations and politics can also be. I hope I see at least one day of peace in my country. I have not seen that yet. I hope LGBT people get to stop having to choose between being happy or being alive. And I hope everyone else notices why that harms everyone, not just LGBT victims. Because discrimination, as I said, is at the core of our conflict, and the lack of peaceful conflict resolution is at the core of our conflict. And if we keep having people who are forbidden or exiled out of love, out of identity, then this will keep happening again and again and again. So finally, what I hope is that this is the beginning of a series of other transitional systems around the world that will include women and LGBT people meaningfully. So we can see in other parts of the world how to do this in a better way, how to heal your wounds as a society, as an individual after war, when you are a woman or when you are an LGBT person. I hope we get to see that our actors acknowledge and actually do something to improve their victims' lives after conflict has ended. So I hope we get to see a better Earth tomorrow and every day after that.
Amen. No, that's that's certainly what we hope for. And I just think about the trust that people have put in Colombia Diversa too, the people who've been giving their testimonies, you know, who, as you say, many of them have never experienced a day of peace in their life, right? This armed conflict has gone on for so long. And yeah, and I think that the level of trust too that they have to trust that it's worth it, right? If I tell my story, it's worth it because the story needs to be known. This needs to be part of the national narrative. It's so important. I think there is a question from Laura. Ashley, were you going to?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Laura. So Laura is wondering if the LGBTIQ plus community in Colombia has been participating in the Truth Commission. And if so, now that it's almost ending its 3-year term, what are your thoughts on the outcomes of the commission?
Thank you. That's an amazing question. The Truth Commission, as I told you, those institutions that are a result of the peace accord, I truly believe in them because they truly believe in this gender approach. And they did this, when they were starting, they did this hard and not so popular questions like, why does this matter? And they truly listened when we explained, and they sought out for us. They said, well, who is, I don't know, an authority, if you could say that, but who is the expert about LGBT people? And let's talk to them, and let's talk to LGBT victims and understand why this matters. And let's try to understand why what we do needs to have or has to have an LGBT perspective. So the Truth Commission, they did a tremendous job. I am so optimistic. I'm in general an optimistic, but with the Truth Commission, I feel really good. They just gained 6 more months in their 3-year term because of the pandemic. So their final report will be public in June or July of the next year. And they talked with us, Colombia Diversa. They also talked with another national LGBT organization that is Caribe Afirmativo. And like via us or by us, they also talked to direct victims. We held at least 3 meetings with direct victims of conflict and truth commissioners. And they did like spaces of listening, that is how they call it. They saw our reports, they did questions. We have, so this is a good publicity moment. We have a report, our report for the Truth Commission is called Who is Going to Tell Our Story? So this is all like one meaning sort of conversation. Mm-hmm. And what we did, this is gonna come out in English soon enough this year, I promise. And what we did was we gathered all of these individual interviews we have done, almost 45, and we analyzed them in terms of the war logics, because that is something that has been done in Colombia lengthy. How the war happens when you are a campesino, how it happens when you are a landowner, how it happens in this part of the country and not in this other one. So what we did was we used all of those conflict studies and we sort of brought it down to these individual interviews. And we added another layer of interpretation that is the queer studies interpretation and the feminist interpretation. And that is the report. That is who is going to tell our story. You can find it online. And so what I hope, and they have said this several times, the Truth Commission, they have said this, is that they're going to do a chapter based only about gendered violence. And what they mean by that is prejudice-based violence against LGBT people and machisto or misogynistic violence against women. So they have a chapter for only that, which I am eager to see. And they also have like a transversal lens on the whole report. And they incorporated this analysis or this category of prejudice-based violence that us, Colombia Diversa, offered to the Truth Commission in order to truly understand where this violence comes from and what are the effects of it in LGBT people's lives.
Amazing. So, some of us, oops, am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Yeah, no, a number of us in Canada too have met with the Truth Commission. We had Carlos Beristain, one of the commissioners, come to Canada. He met with a number of people in the Colombian diaspora who gave testimony as well. And yeah, I met with him when I was in Colombia, and it's such an important report. We'll be looking forward to it. I think we've got another question from Esperanza. Ashley,
Thanks, Jill.
Yeah.
And thanks, Esperanza, for the question. So Esperanza said, as a born Colombian, I understand what you mean about how without cultural changes, the progress for LGBTIQ rights are near impossible to achieve in Colombia. And can you give us any examples of cultural interventions that have proven effective to produce positive change?
Oof. Well, hola paisana Esperanza. Good to see you. Good to read you. There are many things that have worked. In this country, it was illegal to be gay, particularly a gay male, till 1980. So we have come a long way. One of them is definitely education. I'm a sucker for education, but that has worked. Some of those international treaties Bill was mentioning that Colombia signs and signs. One of those, or some of those, included some commitments based on what the minimum requirements were for public teaching or for what public schools were supposed to teach. And that included, of course, part about sexuality or basic knowledge of your own body. This is like undisputed. This is not like a bias or an ideology, heavy sort of education. It was just like teach children that they have hands and elbows and I don't know, penises and vulvas, like teach them that. It was used and it was properly taught to children. That improved radically. Another thing, and that improved like these children's, then teenagers, approach to non-normative sexualities or gender identities, because they already understood that what we call this is just a name. So we can do with that whatever we want, as long as it feels true to ourselves. Another thing that worked definitely was representation. Telenovelas, of course. I don't want to sound like tacky or stereotypical, but it is true. We're a telenovela, What's Your Country? And the first lesbian kiss, it was like in a novel called Aroma y Café. It was like in 1990 something, I don't know. But that was a spike for lesbian representation, particularly when people think lesbians are unable to have sex because there is not a man involved. That was like, oh, wait, so they're not just friends. Because people used to think, and sometimes they still do, like, oh, those two women, like they're so close, such good friends, almost like sisters. So they never, like it never goes through their minds that they might be a couple. So this And it feels stupid and small, but this kiss on a telenovela, it was also the inauguration for other cultural products to do it as well. And well, right now we have a lesbian mayor in Bogota. I have some political differences with her, but the fact that she is like an openly lesbian woman who is in office of the second most important charge in our country, like you get to be president of the country, and the second most important office is being the mayor of Bogota. So the fact that she's a lesbian, she's in a long-term relationship with another woman who is a congresswoman, by the way, it's important. So you get to see how you can do politics by being LGBT. You get to have public discourse, and you get to be part of your community, which is what I was telling you in the beginning of this conversation. So those things matter. And what we're doing in Colombia Diversa, with the support of Interpares, I am happy to say, we're telling stories. I think I am also a literature major. I think storytelling is at the core of humanity. That is what we are. We tell stories to each other to pass time, to seduce one another, to have fun, to learn. So what we're trying to do from Colombia Diversa is storytelling, making LGBT people more than victims, showing how they are also human, how they have suffered, how, like, what were their dreams before they were victims? What are their dreams now? How they, for example, like, what is the happiest day of their lives? And it has nothing to do with the armed conflict, like nothing. Like, you wouldn't believe it. How they fell in love for the first time, how they felt when they moved in with their loved ones. When we do that, we get to move along a little bit those cultural prejudices. Because in the end, what a prejudice is that you sort of dehumanize other people because you consider them not as similar to yourself. And then we go and we look and we see that we're all the same. We just want to have a good time. We just want to be loved. We just want to do, I don't know, some sort of financial dream. Like, I want to put up a restaurant. I want to own my own business. I want to have my own line of whatever fashion. And in that we are very similar. Yeah, I go to bed with a woman. You go to bed with a man. But everything else? So showing that by storytelling is, I think, what is going to work out the most.
Anna, thanks so much. I think you've given us a feeling almost like we were in the room with you today. You know, it's just a very intimate space and very, you know, in the midst of this crazy pandemic and Zoom calls. Yeah, unfortunately, we're at the end of our webinar, but I wanted to also to give a plug for people to check out Colombia Diversa's website. And there's another groundbreaking report that they produced, which is translated into English, called Orders of Prejudice. And I think we're going to put that in the, there's the link. So you can take a look at that. And it details the impact of the conflict on LGBTQ people in Colombia. So these are incredible resources that are contributing not just to Colombia, but to the world. You know, these are stories, these are people's lives. And, you know, I just want to say too, as an LGBTQ activist myself, I think like Susana, like I've never ceased to be amazed at the examples of courage, resistance, resilience of so many other 2S LGBTQ people. So yeah, Susana, thank you. Yeah, it's been great to have you join us, and thanks so much to our interpreter Fanny. Thanks to Monique, to Ashley, to all who have been involved, to all of our participants today, people who asked questions. It's been really great to have been with you. So, buenas tardes, you know, buen dia, wherever you are. Have a great day.